Lena's heart skipped a beat as the police car slowed to a stop beside her. She tightened her grip on Emma and Luke's hands, her mind racing. The officers stepped out, their eyes filled with suspicion. "Ma'am, are these your children?" It was a question she'd answered before, but this time something was different, something dangerous. As Emma's tiny voice trembled, "Mommy, what's happening?" Lena realized that her worst fear was unfolding right before her eyes. Before we get started, let us know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your location in the comment below. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon. Lena, a kind-hearted black woman, was walking hand in hand with her two foster children, Emma and Luke. They were both white, with soft blonde hair and bright eyes. Emma was 7, and Luke was 5, and they adored Lena just as much as she adored them. They were a happy little family, even though they didn't look like most families. Lena had been their foster mother for almost a year now, and every day with them felt like a gift. The children loved their time with her, and today was no different. "Mommy, can we go feed the ducks?" Luke asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. His small hands tugged at Lena's fingers as he pointed toward the pond where ducks waddled near the water's edge. "Of course we can," Lena replied, smiling down at him. She loved how Luke and Emma called her Mommy. Even though she was their foster mother, she felt like their real mom, and she treated them with the same love and care as if they were her own. They hurried over to the pond, where Emma pulled out a small bag of breadcrumbs. "Here, duckies," she called, tossing pieces of bread into the water. Luke giggled as the ducks quacked and swam toward them, eager for their treat. The children's laughter filled the air, and Lena's heart swelled with happiness. For a while, everything felt perfect, from the sound of her children laughing to the peacefulness of the park. It all made Lena forget about the troubles of the world. She was focused on the joy of the moment, watching her children play. But as they left the park and began walking down the sidewalk, things started to change. Lena noticed people glancing at them. More than just the usual curious stares, some people seemed confused. A couple of older women sitting on a nearby bench whispered to each other, their eyes following Lena and the children as they passed. Lena was used to people looking at them differently. She knew it was because of how they looked. Her dark skin, their fair skin. Sometimes people didn't understand that families didn't have to look the same to be full of love. She had learned to ignore the stares, but today the looks felt heavier, as if something was building in the air. She tightened her grip on Emma and Luke's hands, holding them close as they walked. Emma looked up at her, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Why are people staring at us, Mommy?" she asked. Lena gave her a gentle smile, trying to keep her voice calm. "They're just curious, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." But inside, Lena couldn't help feeling uneasy. She could sense something was wrong, though she didn't know what. It was as if the peacefulness of the day had suddenly been overshadowed by a strange tension. That's when she heard it, the sound of a police car's engine approaching. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the car pull up beside them, its lights flashing. 2 policemen stepped out, their eyes locked onto her and the children. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The policemen didn't smile or greet her. Instead, they walked up with suspicious looks on their faces. Lena's heart began to pound. She didn't know why they were coming toward her, but something in their expressions made her feel like she had done something wrong, even though she hadn't. "Ma'am, can we speak to you for a moment?" one of the officers said, his voice firm. He was tall and stern-looking, his hand resting on his belt. Lena tried to stay calm, but her stomach twisted in knots. "Of course, officer," she replied, her voice steady even though she felt a growing sense of dread. The second officer, shorter and younger, looked down at Emma and Luke, his brows furrowed in confusion. "Are these your children?" he asked, his tone sharp. Lena felt her chest tighten. She had been asked this question before by strangers who didn't understand their family, but it had never been this intense, never in a situation that felt so serious. "Yes, they are," Lena said, her voice soft but confident. "I'm their foster mother." The policeman exchanged a glance, and the taller one took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any proof of that? We've had a report of a suspicious person with children that don't match the description." Lena's heart sank. She realized what they were thinking. They didn't believe her. They thought she had kidnapped Emma and Luke because they didn't look like her. "Wait, no," Lena said, her voice rising slightly in panic. "I didn't. These are my foster children. I can show you the paperwork." Luke tugged on her arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, what's happening? Are we in trouble?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Lena knelt down quickly, trying to comfort him. "No, baby, everything's okay," she said, but her own fear was growing. She turned back to the officers. "Please let me explain. I have their documents. You can call the agency. They'll tell you everything." But the policemen weren't listening. The taller one frowned and raised his voice. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions. Step away from the children." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Step away. From her own children. "No, please, you don't understand," she pleaded, feeling the panic rise in her chest. Emma and Luke clung to her legs, their faces pale with fear. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just taking care of them. They're my family." The officers didn't seem to care. Their voices grew louder, more demanding, as they continued to question her. Lena's heart raced, her mind spinning. She didn't know how to make them believe her, and she could feel the situation spiraling out of control. People around them had started to gather, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out recording. Lena felt trapped, surrounded by eyes, suspicion and fear. She didn't know what was going to happen, but one thing was clear. This happy day had suddenly gone very, very wrong. Lena's heart pounded as the policeman's eyes bore into her, their suspicion clear. The taller officer's voice was harsh, cutting through the afternoon's peaceful atmosphere. "We've had reports of a woman fitting your description with 2 kids who don't look like her. We need you to explain why you're with them," he said, his tone sharp and accusing. Lena swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, though panic was bubbling up inside her. She had done nothing wrong, but the way the officers looked at her made her feel as if she had. She took a deep breath and said, "I already told you, officer. These are my foster children. I'm taking care of them. Their parents." The shorter officer cut her off, his voice even colder. "Foster children, huh? Can you prove it? Where's your paperwork?" Lena's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling with the zipper. Emma and Luke stood close, clinging to her legs. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. "No, sweetie, it's just a misunderstanding," Lena whispered, her voice trembling, though she tried to sound calm for the children's sake. She pulled out her ID and a folder containing copies of the foster care paperwork. "Here, I have their documents. Please, just check them. You'll see that everything is fine." But instead of looking at the papers, the taller officer shook his head. "That's not enough. How do we know these aren't forged?" Lena's heart sank. "Please call the agency. They'll tell you everything. I'm not lying." But the officers seemed determined not to believe her. They exchanged a look, and then the taller one stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the children." Lena's stomach twisted into a tight knot. "What? No, I'm not stepping away from them. They're my kids." "They're not your kids," the shorter officer snapped, his voice rising. "We're not going to let you run off with these children. Now step away, or we'll have to take action." Lena's pulse raced. The situation was spiraling out of control and fast. She glanced down at Emma and Luke, who were now holding onto her with all their strength, their small hands gripping her clothes. "Mommy, I'm scared," Luke whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's going to be okay, baby," Lena said, though her own voice shook with fear. She looked back at the officers, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. "Please, you're scaring them. Just call the agency. They'll explain everything." But the officers weren't listening. The taller one reached out and grabbed Lena's arm roughly, pulling her away from the children. "I told you to step back," Emma screamed, her voice piercing the air. "No, leave Mommy alone." She tried to grab Lena's hand, but the officer's grip was too strong. Luke began to cry, his face red and his sobs loud as he watched helplessly. "Stop," Lena cried, trying to pull her arm free, but the officer tightened his hold, his fingers digging into the skin. "Please, don't do this in front of the kids. They're terrified." The crowd around them had grown. People were murmuring, some watching in confusion, others with concern. A few had their phones out, recording the scene. Lena could hear the low hum of voices, some whispering that something wasn't right, others assuming the worst. "Is she really their mom?" someone muttered. "It doesn't look like it. Why else would the cops be here?" another voice said. Lena felt trapped, overwhelmed by the weight of the officer's suspicion and the eyes of the crowd. She knew this could end terribly. Her mind raced with horrible possibilities, being taken away, the children left crying, scared, wondering what had happened to their mother. "Officer, please," Lena begged again, her voice cracking with desperation. "Just check the documents or call the agency. I'm telling the truth. You don't need to do this." But the officers seemed unmoved. The shorter one stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The sight of them made Lena's heart stop for a moment. "No, no, no," she whispered under her breath, panic clawing at her throat. They couldn't be serious. They weren't really going to arrest her in front of the children, were they? The officer holding the cuffs took another step closer. "Ma'am, we're taking you in for questioning. If you don't cooperate, things are going to get a lot worse." Lena's mind spun. She couldn't let this happen, not in front of Emma and Luke. The children were crying now, their voices mixing with the murmurs of the crowd. "Mommy, don't go. Please, don't go," Emma sobbed, trying to hold onto Lena's leg, but the officer pulled her further away. "Let me go," Lena pleaded, her voice full of desperation. "They need me. They're scared. Please, you don't understand." The crowd began to stir more, some people shaking their heads, others stepping forward as if they might intervene. "This is wrong," someone shouted. "You've got the wrong person," another voice called out. But the officers weren't listening to the crowd either. They were focused on Lena, determined to control the situation. Lena felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong for the children. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low but steady. "Please, don't do this." The officer with the handcuffs hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing as if he wasn't sure what to do next. But then the taller officer spoke again, his voice cold. "We're not taking any chances. Cuff her." Lena's heart sank. The officer stepped forward, reaching for her wrists, and she knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. Just as the handcuffs clicked open, ready to close around her wrists, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Stop. Wait." Everything froze for a second. The officers paused, the crowd went quiet, and Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned, praying that someone had finally realized the truth. The officer's hand was inches away from Lena's wrists, the cold metal of the handcuffs gleaming in the afternoon sun. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear clutching her so tightly that it was hard to breathe. Just as the cuffs were about to snap shut, a sudden cry pierced the air. "Stop! She's our mom!" It was Emma. Her small voice, filled with terror and determination, rang out louder than the commotion around them. The crowd gasped, and for a split second, everything froze. The police officers hesitated, their hands still mid-air. Even the murmuring of the people around them stopped, replaced by a heavy, tense silence. Emma, with tears streaming down her face, had broken free from the bystanders and ran up to the officer who was holding the handcuffs. She threw herself between him and Lena, her tiny arms stretched wide as if she could somehow shield her mother from everything that was happening. Her blue eyes were wild with fear, her chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. "She's our mom," Emma screamed again, her voice cracking. "Don't take her away. Please don't take her." Luke, standing a few feet away, was crying too, big silent tears rolling down his cheeks as he clung to Lena's leg. The sight of her children in so much distress broke something inside Lena. She felt tears welling up in her own eyes, but she blinked them back, trying to stay strong for Emma and Luke. She couldn't fall apart now, not when they needed her the most. Lena took a deep, shaky breath and spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, officers, just check the papers. Call the agency. I'm not lying. I'm their foster mother. I love these children." The officer holding the handcuffs looked down at Emma, clearly taken aback by the intensity of her outburst. His hand faltered, lowering the cuffs slightly. He looked over at his partner, who seemed just as confused and uncertain. Neither of them had expected this. The tall officer, his stern expression softening for the first time, glanced from Lena to the crying children, and then to the gathered crowd. Just as it seemed like they might finally listen, another voice rose from the crowd, a woman's voice, calm yet commanding. "That's enough." The officers and the crowd turned toward the voice, and out stepped a woman who looked important, someone with authority. She had sharp eyes, and there was something about her presence that made people pay attention. Her short, grey-streaked hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore a tailored suit that gave her an air of quiet power. Lena blinked, recognizing the woman immediately. It was Mrs. Turner, the head of the foster care agency. Relief washed over Lena so suddenly that her legs almost gave out beneath her. Mrs. Turner had been standing on the edge of the crowd, watching the entire scene unfold, but now she stepped forward, her face set in a firm expression. "Officers, I'm Mrs. Turner, head of the foster care agency," she said, holding up a badge that identified her position. "This woman, Lena, is exactly who she says she is. She's the foster mother of Emma and Luke, and she has been caring for them under our supervision for nearly a year." The policeman looked at Mrs. Turner, then back at Lena, their faces full of confusion and uncertainty. The taller officer's brow furrowed. "But we were told." Mrs. Turner cut him off, her voice sharp and clear. "You were told wrong. Lena is not a kidnapper. She is a licensed foster parent, and these children are in her care by law. I can provide you with all the documentation you need, but I suggest you stop what you're doing immediately." For a long moment, the officers didn't move. The taller one looked down at the handcuffs in his hand, then back at Emma, still standing in front of her mother like a small, determined shield. Slowly, he lowered the cuffs to the side, his face reddening with embarrassment. The shorter officer took a step back, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly as the reality of the situation sank in. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time the tone was different. The tension in the air shifted, and people started whispering angrily, some shaking their heads at the officers. "I knew something wasn't right," a woman in the crowd said. "They should have listened to her from the start," another person muttered. Lena stood there, still gripping Emma's hand, her body trembling from the flood of emotions coursing through her. She didn't feel relief, not yet. Her heart was still racing, her hands still shaking. It was as if her mind hadn't caught up with the fact that the danger was passing. She had been so sure just moments ago that she was about to be taken away from her children. That fear still clung to her, making it hard to breathe. Mrs. Turner turned to Lena, her expression softening as she reached out and gently placed a hand on Lena's arm. "It's okay, Lena. You and the children are safe now." Lena nodded, but her throat was too tight to speak. She knelt down, pulling both Emma and Luke into a tight hug, holding them close as if she could protect them from everything that had just happened. Emma buried her face in Lena's shoulder, still sniffling, while Luke clung to her side, his small body trembling with leftover fear. The taller officer cleared his throat, his face flushed with shame. We're sorry, ma'am. We didn't mean to." Mrs. Turner turned to him sharply. "You should be. Next time, I suggest you verify your information before assuming the worst." The officers nodded stiffly, both of them looking thoroughly chastised. The crowd around them continued to murmur, some people still recording on their phones, others shaking their heads in disapproval. The tension that had hung so thick in the air was starting to lift, but Lena still felt its weight pressing down on her. She looked up at Mrs. Turner, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. If you hadn't been here, I don't know what would have happened." Mrs. Turner gave her a small, kind smile. "You don't need to thank me. You've been through enough today. Let's get you and the kids home." But even as the officers stepped back and the crowd began to disperse, Lena's heart didn't feel completely at ease. She had just come so close to losing everything, and the fear of it still lingered, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. The two policemen stood awkwardly, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The taller officer shifted on his feet, unable to meet Lena's gaze. The shorter one looked down at the ground, his fingers nervously tapping the handcuffs at his belt. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence felt heavy, thick with everything that had just happened. "We're sorry," the taller officer mumbled, his voice stiff with discomfort. "We didn't mean for things to get this far." Lena wanted to say something, maybe to tell them how wrong they had been, how much they had scared her and her children. She could feel anger bubbling up inside her, but it was quickly overtaken by something deeper, something heavier, sadness. She felt tired, worn out by the fear and confusion of the past few minutes. All she wanted was to take Emma and Luke home, to wrap them in her arms and remind them that they were safe. Lena knelt down and pulled her children close, hugging them tightly. Emma's small body was still trembling, and Luke sniffled softly, his arms wrapped around her neck. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they had seen enough to know that something was very wrong. Lena's heart ached as she held them, wishing she could protect them from moments like this. Mrs. Turner, standing beside them, spoke up, her voice firm, but calm. "This was a huge mistake, officers," she said, her eyes narrowing as she addressed the two men. "You should have been more careful. You should have listened to her from the beginning. Next time, don't jump to conclusions just because things don't look the way you expect." The taller officer nodded, his face still red. "We understand, ma'am. We're truly sorry." His voice was low, filled with shame. But even though the danger was over, Lena couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The fear still clung to her like a shadow, and her mind kept drifting to the worst possibilities. What if Mrs. Turner hadn't been there? What if the officers had arrested her, leaving Emma and Luke behind, confused and scared? The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. She couldn't bear to think about what might have happened. As the officers stood there, waiting awkwardly for some kind of response, Lena looked up at them. She could see that they were genuinely sorry now, but that didn't take away the pain of what she had just experienced. "Is there anything we can do to make this right?" the shorter officer asked, his voice quieter than before. He seemed sincere, but the question felt empty. What could they possibly do to fix the fear they had caused, the trauma they had inflicted on her children? Lena shook her head slowly. "No," she said softly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I just want to take my kids home." The officers nodded, understanding. The taller one fumbled in his pocket for a moment before pulling out a small card. He handed it to Lena, his eyes full of regret. "If you ever need anything at all, please call. I promise something like this won't happen again." Lena took the card, but didn't say much. She wasn't sure she believed him. She knew that moments like this could happen again. But she didn't want to linger any longer. She needed to get away from this place, away from the memory of how close she had come to losing everything. As she stood up, Emma and Luke clung to her hands, their small fingers gripping hers tightly as if they were afraid she might slip away. They didn't speak, but their wide, teary eyes were full of questions. As they began to walk away, Emma finally broke the silence. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why did the police treat you like that? You didn't do anything wrong." Lena's heart clenched at the question. She had been dreading it, knowing that one day the children would begin to see the world differently, knowing that they would have to understand things that were hard, things that weren't fair. But how could she explain this to them in a way that wouldn't hurt even more? She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Sometimes people don't see the truth right in front of them," Lena said softly. "They look at things and think they know what's going on, but they're wrong. They make mistakes." Emma furrowed her brow, confused. "But why, Mommy? Why didn't they believe you?" Lena stopped walking and knelt down in front of her children, her hands gently holding theirs. "Because the world isn't always fair," she said quietly, her voice filled with sadness. "Sometimes people judge others by what they see on the outside, not by what's real. But we know the truth, don't we? We know who we are, and we know that our family is full of love." Emma and Luke nodded slowly, though Lena could see they were still trying to understand. They were so young, too young to have faced this kind of confusion and fear. As they continued walking, Lena held their hands tightly, trying to push away the lingering fear that clung to her. They passed the spot where the crowd had gathered, now mostly dispersed, and Lena could hear the quiet hum of the city returning to normal around them. But she knew that nothing about today had been normal. It was a day that would stay with her, and with Emma and Luke, for a long time. But as they walked together, Lena told herself that they would be okay. They were strong, and they had each other. And in the end, that was what mattered most. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please subscribe for more inspiring stories. They were strong, and they had each other. And in the end, that was what mattered most. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please subscribe for more inspiring stories.